just a poor wayfaring stranger, a traveling through this world of woe. There's no sickness, no toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go. I'm going there to see my Father and all my loved ones who've gone on. I'm just a going over Jordan. I'm just a going over home. Hi. Welcome back. I'd like to start talking more about the specific details regarding what I have discovered, my family, and what I have discovered about them. As I have said, I had become acquainted with the idea we had Romani Ancestry several years ago, and really just didn't think I'd be able to find anything in any records anywhere. And then at one point, my aunt wrote a book about what it was like growing up with her mother and father and 7 siblings as they navigated challenges like moving around the United States frequently due to my grandfather's service in the military, surviving with very little money and a lot of mouths to feed, being the outsiders in many of the communities they found themselves in. As I read this book, I began to notice very familiar patterns, and those patterns were ones I had become familiar with during my time learning about Romani people. I saw the types of things that held them together, that sustained them, that helped them adapt to ever-changing environments and social constructs. They remained connected to family and friends all over the United States and in Norway. They used their talents and skills to work and help out, but also to build community and bring joy into their lives, to equip themselves with coping tools for the stress and anxiety they faced. In all the places they went, these things never changed. The love they had for one another and the tools passed down through generations to adapt and become resilient. This is what I grew up seeing that family meant. They are your home, your support, where you go to learn about life, learn skills not taught in many other places, to learn about living sustainably, and maybe, without even knowing, how to code switch between our private and public-facing identities. That was when I decided to pick up the threads again and became more determined to see what I could find if only I tried. This book felt like the map that I needed to begin to follow the breadcrumbs. As I read it, particularly chapters that talked about my grandmother and her upbringing, memories of stories, of passages, of little things I'd read here and there, of little heirlooms that had been discovered, all that began to swirl around in my brain, and I began to piece things together finally. None of this was random. None of it was coincidence. It was learned, and it was being passed down through my grandmother and those open channels all the way back to Norway, even if they didn't explain how far back this all went. I will start this next section talking about my great-grandfather, who he was, where he grew up, what brought him to the US, and what happened after he got here.
He was born Norman Zakaus in Sandvestfold, Norway in 1903. Not long after, the family moved to and began working at the Eidsfossverks, where Norman's father became a coachman for the owner of the company, and they lived in the manor house. Norman would help his father care for the horses, and he began drawing and painting at this time, often of the horses and the buildings there where they lived and worked. During this time, Norman began art lessons with prominent artists of the time period. I don't know a lot of the details, but I know he traveled often and studied art along the way with different tutors. While at Eidsvoss, Norman's 3 sisters were born, the oldest of which passed away as an infant. Norman attended the Eidsvoss school, and the family, though they belonged, as did everyone at the time, to the state church, attended the local Eidsvoss chapel. They attended and had all of the children baptized and confirmed there at the Eidsvoss chapel. This was a strategic move by multiple people in my family at that time because it was a heavily protected place to work for a Romani family. The ironworks operated as its own community. Under the careful supervision of the Schwartz family, who owned the facility at this time. Because it was private property, it was very difficult for law enforcement to investigate anyone employed there. They couldn't really just show up and march in, because that's not how it worked, especially with people who had a certain status within the community. Law enforcement had a hard time getting in and doing things like that. So since the Eidsvoss church kept its own records, they did not need to be registered. They were registered with the state church, but the paperwork and everything could just stay within that local church. It didn't need to be submitted to the parish church. So there was a little bit of leeway because of that. I'll explain more of that maybe perhaps later if it's relevant. But anyway, just so you get the idea. They did that in the state-run parishes would have been more revealing. So doing that through the chapel added another layer of protection. It also seems like Anton and Agat, who were Norman's parents, were able to get officially married at this time. If you look at my great-grandfather's birth record, it has a little note in the margin about how he was a child born out of wedlock. And even though he had already been born, Anton and Agat appear together in several records kind of leading up to this point where my great-grandfather had already been born, but they were not listed as a married couple. And my great-grandmother was listed still as Pige, or Pike at the time, which meant young unmarried woman. And sometimes I think they might have even tried to pass her off as a relative as opposed to a wife. So anyway, that was some of the things that I saw happening in the records. Anyway, so I think perhaps that Eidsvoss is a little different because at the time in Norway, parish priests were not allowed to. They were forbidden to perform marriages for Romani couples. So sometimes you had to get married in your community and not be formally recognized by the state until you found a church that was willing to help you bend the rules. Anyway, so that happened sometimes. Sometime during Norman's teen years, the family gained employment at the Jarlsberg estate, the home estate of the Counts of Vedel Jarlsberg family, who had been Norway's most elite family for many generations. And they were instrumental in helping the newly appointed royal family integrate into Norway after they gained their independence from Sweden in 1905. During Norman's time there at the Jarlsberg estate, he worked alongside his father, who worked as the master of the stables at the estate. And Norman also attended the private school at Jarlsberg, which was a school that was opened specifically for the staff people who worked at the Jarlsberg estate. And he also received private tutoring in art by Karl Wedel Jarlsberg, who, along with his sister, was also a very gifted painter. So he was taken under the wing, basically, of many people from, it's like age 12, I guess, or around there, through his young adulthood until he immigrated. So thankfully, they moved from one community into another community where they were living on a privately owned estates, where they had their own schools, they had their own churches, they had their own community of people, and they had a significant amount of protection that way. Later on, I would like to, at some point, share some of what I've read in their personal letters and some things like that really help you see that while all of that was true, there was still a lot of movement happening. It was just that they kind of moved between all the different families that they worked for, and also were still taking care of some of their own properties and things like that they had been left with, or so there's a lot of movement, and they're still moving around quite a lot, just kind of seasonally timed, and because of their jobs, it seemed like a thing that seemed reasonable to do. Anyway, so before I move on to the journey across the sea, I feel like there's some historical context that we need to talk about. So around 1900, a couple of laws had been passed, which, along with the use of privately funded and state-supported religious organizations, made it possible to remove Romani children from their homes by declaring the parents unfit due to their lifestyle. So essentially, they used fear-mongering and stereotypes to convince the government and other agencies that the growing Romani population would lead to increased crime. There wasn't really a growing Romani population. The Romani population had stayed basically the same for hundreds of years. They had been there for hundreds of years at this point, and they had really, a lot of them had become integral parts of their communities by providing, essential services and tools and goods and things like that. And so, this obviously was being kind of sparked by a lot of the political movements at the time all over the world. Anyway, so they convinced the government that these things were true. So Norway, of course, was not the only nation around this time who started adopting these types of policies, and the Romani people weren't the only target in Scandinavia or Europe as a whole or globally. There appeared to be a growing mentality among the European nations that the only people who belonged to any particular nation had to be the ideal fantasy version of what the people of that nation were supposed to be. And that just really isn't super realistic. This could be easily said also for many other parts of the world at the time, not just Europe. Between 1900 and 1970, an estimated 1,500 Romani children, which was about 1 to 2/3 of the children born during that time, were forcibly removed from their parents. Wherever they were placed, whether that was orphanages or foster homes or schools and other institutions, they were not allowed to speak Romani or communicate with their families. In 1908, forced assimilation of the entire Romani families began. So now they're like, not only are we going to take the children, but we're also going to make you live somewhere. And if you don't come with us willingly, we're going to take your children from you or put you in prison. And take your children from you and put you in prison. So either you come willingly and you sign this contract and you say that you are willing to give up everything about your identity and your heritage, and we'll let you live. Yeah. And we won't take your children away. So at these camps, they weren't permitted to participate in any of their cultural traditions. No Romani music, no Romani language, no Romani traditional clothing, nothing of that kind. Not long after this, in the 1930s, eugenics-based sterilizations began. So yes, this is after my great-grandfather had immigrated, but his sisters and his mother and his aunts and uncles and cousins and his dad, they were still there. And they are still there. Between 1949 and 1970, 40% of Romani women in just one of those labor camps had been sterilized. As all of this was starting and happening all around them, my family, like other families at the time, built their survival around being able to blend in well enough to code switch while keeping their traditions and culture alive, but very carefully. Sometimes even I have these mixed feelings of, wow, I'm so glad that my family was safe. They made it, relatively unharmed, probably better off than many of the other families at that time. But also, like, how could they be okay and live their lives knowing that members of their community were being targeted and abused? And, I'm sure that the inner turmoil was there. I know it would have been for me. But, I know the answer because this question has been asked many times about many types of people throughout history. No one knows what they would do in a similar situation, really, until it happens to them. And everyone is trying to survive and keep their children as safe as they can. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, there is a cost, a loss of identity, a loss of faith, a loss of friends and family, and a loss of family history. So now that we have that context, let me turn to my great-grandfather's story. In 1923, Norman immigrated to the United States and arrived via Ellis Island in New York City right at the end of the era of America's open borders policies. Many Romani families from Norway and other parts of the world immigrated right around that time because it was known that soon the borders were going to be more difficult to get through. And often they would send a young man to plant roots in the United States, which provided some options for the future for extended family members as well. Even when my great-grandfather got here, other members of the family had already immigrated, and that is, where he went after he came over initially. He was instructed to get to know his aunts and uncles and cousins really well, and to be friends with them, and to learn from them, and to be careful, just like they had been in Norway. So he lived for a time with family in the northern states of America, like Minnesota and Michigan and Wisconsin, which were home to a lot of other Scandinavian immigrants at the time. After some time, he traveled to Mexico and studied some art there before heading to Texas, where he made his home here in Austin. He studied art here as well and eventually became well known in the state of Texas for his paintings. He became the director of the Texas School of Fine Arts and painted several commissioned works for the state of Texas. During this time, he met my great-grandmother, Fanny Vilma Harris, who was also an artist. They collaborated on many projects throughout their lives together. He tried out a few names over the course of his time in the United States, but eventually he had it formally changed to Charles Berkeley Norman. This name has now been passed down a few generations, which is very in line with Romani traditions, even though we didn't know that. Actually, this is not the only name that was passed down, interestingly. I believe that the name Charles was a nod to my great-grandfather's middle name, Zacchaeus. In Norway, Zacchaeus is the spelling for Zacchaeus, and it's pronounced sort of like Sakos. I think maybe people thought he was saying Charles with an accent, so he just kind of went with it maybe. That said, it ends up being significant because the name Zacchaeus in Norway appears heavily throughout Romani families. First, they used a lot of biblical names, and they often used the less common biblical names. remember they used, family naming traditions to keep track of their networks and, the families so that they could recognize each other. Zacchaeus in particular is a biblical figure that is particularly meaningful to the Romani because of his status as an outsider in the story that he's a part of. Two other names that were used often in the naming traditions of my family and the Romani in general were Jana and Emmy. Jana is the pet form name of Joanna and similar names like Joanne, that sort of thing. And Emmy is the pet name form of Matilda and associated names like Matilda and things like that. All of these names appear frequently in my family tree, especially when you start adding in all of the Joannas and Joannes and Matildes and Matildas, in addition to the Jannas and Emmys. And actually, all of those names made it here to the U.S., the Zacchaeus, because of my personal opinion about that becoming Charles, but also Jana and Emmy directly. I have an aunt named Jana and a cousin named Emmy, and Emmy we knew because one of my great-grandfather's sisters was named Emmy, so that one was definitely on purpose. But my aunt didn't know either, apparently, that one of our great-great-grandfather's sisters was named Jana. And I don't know that my grandmother knew that either. I sort of wonder if maybe my great-grandfather was just, like, oh, maybe Jana. Jana's a nice name. And they went with that. Interestingly enough, my Aunt Jana is the youngest of all of her siblings, and the Jana that I think she was named after was also the youngest of all of her siblings. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting. She also had a very interesting life, that Jana, and so maybe at another time I can share a little bit more about that because she did have a very interesting life. So soon after the birth of my grandmother and her brother, World War II began. My great-grandfather became very worried about his family, and I remember talking to my grandmother about this, a conversation with my uncle that gave me a hint, and a few letters that my grandmother wrote to a relative gave me some other hints. My great-grandfather had been particularly worried about the people in the home parishes of his parents and family members, and was glad that they were living at the Jarlsberg estate at the time because it was very safe for them there. He could not travel to Norway at this time as it was occupied by German forces. Instead, he was recruited by the military because of his knowledge of Norway. Using his memory of Norway, aerial photographs, and his skills as an artist and traveler, he drew up maps of Norway for the military to use to safely navigate their way through Norway. During his time growing up, I'm sure that he had known some clever backways between towns and villages, particularly in the primary areas the Germans had set up shop. A story from my aunt's book sheds a little more light on this guess of mine, but I will bring that in again later. Due to his service during the war, my great-grandfather was given citizenship, and that was when he formally changed his name. I believe that at some point he, or possibly he and my great-grandmother, took a trip to Norway so she could meet his family, and they also brought home some family heirlooms as wedding gifts. He could do all sorts of things, as could my great-grandmother. They could sculpt, sew, quilt, paint, draw, do so many artistic things. My great-grandfather also practiced carpentry and woodworking. There's actually a really funny story that my grandmother told about how one day he had been out building a doghouse, and he came in and he was all sweaty and he was wearing this University of Texas shirt. And this is like, he's older now in this story, but apparently he saw himself in the mirror and really thought he looked really funny. So he just painted a quick portrait, self-portrait of himself in this state, because I guess, obviously we didn't have selfie cameras back then. You just had to sit down and paint a quick portrait of yourself. No, there were definitely cameras, but that's not where his brain went. His brain went to, I have to paint this because it's hilarious. So anyway, that's a funny story. Anyway, so he lived a good life, and he passed away in 1985, which was 2 years before I was born. I've always been sad that I never met him in person. I did get to meet my great-grandmother, though. We visited her several times before she passed away in 1999. I could do another video series on just her and her family as well, but and maybe I will someday. She was one cool lady, and both she and my great-grandfather were deeply involved in the goings-on of Austin, so I feel a deep connection to them. Well, I still live here in that same city. Okay, so as I began to dig deeper, I learned that it was common for Romani immigrants to travel to either Mexico or Canada after they immigrated and re-enter the country from one of those locations as basically another way to add a layer of protection to their paper trail. I also learned that Texas has one of the highest Romani populations in the United States. There are about 20,000 Romani people living here. Of all the Romani people living in the United States, about 70% conceal their heritage, which leads me to say this. My choice to talk about my family and do so through a public medium is mine, but I take it very seriously because I know it's a risky choice for people, and I understand why people don't choose to do that. Anyway, so I have also felt the need because of this to be careful to protect the identities of people I know who've helped me with my research and things like that. Even in just the few months I have openly talked about this part of my family history, I've had a negative experience with prejudice. Many of the Romani descendants of my generation are speaking out and telling the stories of our families. And I think that reason is different, for all of us. But one reason is because awareness is important if we ever want things to change and improve. And if something like this can continue to pass under the radar, then we aren't really holding ourselves accountable for our part in it, are we? My final note for this video, I began to look for clues in the photographs of my family members as well. I looked through them all very carefully for hints, and I found many, but one in particular took me by surprise and even brought me to tears. In several photos, I had noticed that my great-grandfather wore a rather large, sort of signet-looking ring on his left hand, and I had this feeling that this might be significant. And it turned out that one of my uncles actually has the ring, and he sent me some pictures, which was very helpful. I saw the carvings on the rings, and at the top of the ring, there's these very obvious Roman-looking, or at least one very obvious Roman-looking soldier, and then like the profile of another person like behind him who's definitely less decorated, more plain-looking. And then on the sides, though, the image that I saw and what connected to me immediately was this image of, these two elephants with this connected trunk, and then this figure sitting sort of, cross-legged style with prayer hands. And because I had been studying Romani culture and listening to different things, I knew that one of the big things associated with the Romani culture is Saint Sarah, or she's also known as Kali Sarah, or Sarah Kali, or Sarah La Kali, which is Sarah the Black. And basically she's been sort of this revered patron saint of the Romani people for a really long time, probably since the beginning, because kind of what we have figured out, knowing now that the Romani came from India, is that there are a lot of traditions that stayed within the Romani community that harken back to the time that they were in India. And one of those things is there were a few goddesses that seem to have directly influenced this Sarah Kali. One of those goddesses is named Kali, and she's a fierce-looking protector goddess. She overcomes obstacles, and she's sort of represents power. And then there's another goddess, and she is known especially for having like the elephants on her side sort of showering her, and she like represents one of them. I'm not going to get it all straight because, you know, I'm still learning. She represents another thing, and then there's a third one, and she represents wisdom, and she's also seated. She's usually holding like an instrument. And so anyway, so they kind of think that Saint Sarah, or Kali Sarah, came from kind of this meeting or convergence of these goddesses, and had embodied all of these elements, and she became like the protector and guardian of the Romani people. And so when I saw this part of the ring, it just immediately brought to my mind all those images I had seen of these goddesses, and I just started to cry because it just touched me. I mean, I couldn't not see it. And I even now sometimes catch myself going, am I crazy? Am I the only person who sees this? Like, is this obviously not it, like, at all? But the more that I have talked to people, and like the more that I've learned about, like, especially my grandmother really thought that my great-grandfather had designed this ring. And then when we looked at like the markings inside the ring, and I learned about like different types of markings, it seems pretty clear that this probably was a locally made custom ring. And because of his military service, there are definitely like military aspects to it. But I also feel like there are these Hindu aspects to it. And maybe this is just another way that he was able to blend these cultures in a way that was meaningful to him, but also completely socially acceptable, and with maybe a hidden meaning, or a meaning that meant something to him, but he didn't have to come right out and say it because he didn't want to have to answer questions about it. So something in me, I feel like my heart saw what I think it meant, what it really meant, and maybe it doesn't, but either way, it touched me, and that it doesn't change the fact that I saw what I saw. That's the hardest part about this sometimes, is it's not always about logic. Sometimes it is about what you feel. So that's where I wanted to end my story today, with just that really touching moment. And that came after a lot of research and a lot of uncertainty, and it felt like being spoken to from beyond, to be honest. And anyway, so I will end there, and in my next video, I will talk a little more about his upbringing and some more details like that. But I also want to start kind of telling you, okay, so what was happening in Norway after he had immigrated and all of that was going on here, what was going on in Norway with his family, and share some of that. So that will be in the next one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. I know dark clouds will gather around me. I know my way is hard and steep, but beauteous fields arise before me, where God's redeemed their vigils keep. I'm going there to see my mother. She said she'd meet me when I come. I'm just a going over Jordan. I'm just a going over home. I'm just a going